A few days ago, the United States Congress held a hearing with the tech sector's biggest players. They spoke to the CEOs of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And of course, we know these companies as being some of the largest in the world, if not the largest, and they dominate their sectors respectively. Now, the significance of the congressional hearing is really in its objective, in trying to determine whether these companies were actually challenging the competition of the market in a very unfair way and more or less being anti-competitive, whether they were playing fairly. So the specific allegations were such as, for example, Amazon being this leader in online retail, online shopping, more or less spearheading the rise of online e-commerce by helping offline retailers move online. They were also alleged to be directly competing with the sellers by taking the data they have on the platform of which products actually sell well and then directly producing and selling those products themselves, so that they're more or less playing the game as the game masters and also playing the game as the players. And there was obviously a conflict of interest. And then with obviously Apple, one of the phones that, one of the most dominating smartphones in the market by market share. A lot of us may use Apple, its app stores. They generate 13 billion every year from the App Store, one of the most used application stores in the world. But there were allegations in developers that Apple was not being incredibly fair as well in the App Store. They were actually showing favoritism towards certain apps, especially their own, and also the entire process of being on the App Store was really ambiguous. So the question whether they were being competitive and fair as well. And then with Facebook, on the other hand, there were allegations that this company was trying to monopolize social media and social network industry by directly quashing competition, by aggressively acquiring rivals and competitors, and also using leverage to more or less force them out of the market. So they were trying to become a monopoly, it was alleged. And then with Google, one of the most used sites of the world, search engine, there were allegations from the businesses that work with Google and also rivals that Google was using its platform in setting these rules in the systems that really favors itself and locks users and businesses to the platform at everyone else's expense, and also favoring its own assets. For example, showing in results Google assets over others, YouTube over Vimeo, Google reviews over Yelp, for example. So again, a question whether they were being fair. Now, the congressional hearing is significant because it really is a great demonstration of democratic governance, where as these companies in our market economy are becoming much and much more powerful and consolidating their positions, there's really a lot of concern that whether they're actually being fair and whether they would actually challenge the market economy. Because if they are not being competitive and they're not playing fairly, whereas other people are more or less threatened by them through these unfair practices, then that would have economic costs because they would be challenging the free market itself through monopolizing it in very unfair ways and abusing more or less the market economy. And of course, these are great concerns. And all sorts of hearings around the world from different governments have really been focusing on the economic questions of these big tech companies as technology becomes more and more prevalent. But the thing is, I think there should be greater focus beyond just the economic impact. Of course, these companies have great economic impact, but we should also really think carefully about beyond impact, whether these companies are actually influencing society in the ways that we actually want it to be influenced. Because we have to realize that as these tech companies become more prevalent, as technology touches more aspects of society, then there's a question of whether these companies are exerting the sort of sociological influences that we deem acceptable, and maybe we should also govern those. So take for example the knowledge economy, this concept that society now being technology enabled with the rise of the internet, we can now more easily disseminate, distribute, and access knowledge and information throughout the world. That is certainly true. We now live in an age where all of us can very easily access information in a way that we could never do in the past, and that's a great thing. But the way in which we do it are obviously realized through many of these platforms which are run by many of these companies. And some of these are now consolidating their positions as the way. So for example, Google is now more or less the highway of the internet. It's almost the only way for most people, the way they interact and get information online. Now the thing is, Google is also it is an advertising business as well with its search engine. So it is commercially driven. And there has been so many studies and so many reports that over 40% of results shown are actually directly ads or being commercially driven to be shown in terms of its algorithms. So we have to question the nature and the value of the information that's being presented, since these platforms are actually being run by these commercial companies. And there really is no regulation specifically in terms of how such information and towards what extent are these information, can they be commercial and can they actually not be commercial? So there's really this question of whether we can freely access these information and whether there actually are information that are not necessarily agenda driven or maybe being commercially driven. So that really does challenge the concept of the knowledge economy. But beyond that, another spectrum as well, if you look at social media is increasingly becoming the most prevalent form of journalism for most of us. For most internet consumers, for most of us today, social media is where we get most of our news and where we get most of our content. It's the most go-to place. It's really more or less taken over traditional journalism. But then at the same time, with the way it's designed, there's also been a rise in the dissemination of misinformation, information that are obviously misleading or false, or somehow driven by some sort of partisan interests. And that can be very dangerous. Obviously, in a partisan sense, it can be dangerous to politics, as false, politically driven propaganda can actually affect the very functioning of society, but also maybe even directly to health in recent times, especially with the corona pandemic. We've seen all these false content about suggestions to inject certain toxins into your body, because supposedly it helps, but obviously it doesn't. It could potentially be fatal. So we are seeing that as well. And the companies are running these more or less journalistic platforms of today, for example, Facebook. They are not directly commercially incentivized to be too aggressive in their moderation, because of course they are siphoning revenues from the content that's being disseminated. So they don't have a direct interest beyond perhaps regulatory pressure to do so. So that really does also make us question, because obviously that challenges the concept of the idea of journalism itself, the objectivity that was tied to traditional media content that's being promoted, also the scrutiny and the moderation that's involved. That is also something that's vastly changing with the rise of Facebook and now obviously TikTok and all these other platforms, and now disseminating information to so many people. So that really is a question as well. But beyond these, if you think about also the very nature of these businesses, they possess a lot of sociological impact that we have not really considered. You think about how these tech companies are actually so technologically innovative in their very operation. For example, we've seen in recent times the rise of algorithmic management, the mixture of big data and automation in almost most innovative business models. For example, Amazon with their fulfillment centers, they have workers, but of course these workers are actually being managed by these algorithms with these data analytics, these data sets, and these systems that determine which fulfillment center is actually being efficient, which department, which center is not, and then they would determine the human capital needs of the entire operation based on this. So certain people who don't meet the peak efficiency standards, they would actually be terminated. And of course, there's been a lot of complaints about that, people losing jobs like that. Not just limited to Amazon, but also, for example, Uber, in the way that algorithms are actually overtaken transportation in determining how drivers actually work in the fleet, how they procure their jobs. All this based on systematic governance because of how complex it is. But then people are now transformed more or less into data sets. But when we're talking about efficiency, it's great for the company, but humans are not data sets. And obviously their livelihoods are at stake as well. So what I'm trying to say is that beyond the direct economic consequences, there's actually a lot of sociological influence that these companies have on the very nature of our lives. And as technology becomes more and more prevalent in our societies, we really should question carefully some of these influences and overall introduce governance to them as well. Hopefully with more of these such hearings, not only in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, as we recognize the rise of technology and tech companies, we start to think beyond just the economic consequences, which is usually the main focus of most governments, and really think about the sociological ones too, and whether there should be more regulations there. And that's really something we should think about, because in the past, in industrial development, that has always been the case of how we've actually introduced all sorts of different regulations. So that's something we really should think about going forward.